G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Episode 2.28, The Gospels of Mark and Matthew. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, I presented an overview of the sources we have for the life of Jesus, both pagan and Christian. In this and the next two episodes, I'll dive deeper into our primary sources, the four Gospels. I start with the Evangelist and Gospel of Mark. Mark is traditionally symbolized by a winged lion, to show that Christians should be courageous in the face of persecution. The Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, about half the length of Matthew or Luke. The book circulated in at least 3 versions, differing by the ending to the Gospel. Our earliest reference to the book is by the Apostolic Father Papias, who lived around the year 100. You can hear more about him and the other very earliest church fathers in episode 2.21, Battle for the New Testament, Part 1, Earliest Times. The Gospel of Mark was not highly regarded in early Christianity. The very earliest fathers thought its language and structure crude, but they accepted that it was the earliest Gospel. By the time Christianity was made the official religion of the empire, 200 years later, the fathers decided that Matthew was the earliest. Mark, they held, was an uncreative summary of that Gospel. Mark only survived because of its supposed connection to the Apostle Peter. The Gospels of John, Matthew, and Luke are much more widely read than Mark, according to that wonderful resource of all the world's Bibles, BibleGateway.com. Like all the Gospels, Mark is anonymous. Papias attributed the book to one John Mark, whom the book of Acts refers to in a brief aside. Although Acts says nothing about the matter, early church fathers held John Mark to be a companion of the disciple Peter in Rome. He was said to be Peter's interpreter. It's not clear whether they meant he was Peter's translator or Peter's editor and ghostwriter. Modern scholars accept that someone called Mark was the book's author, but they are dubious that he is the person mentioned in Acts, or that he was a companion to Peter. It is unclear if Mark was a Gentile or a Jew, and if his audience was Gentile or Jewish, Greek-speaking or Latin-speaking. Perhaps the best bet is that Mark was a second-generation diaspora Jew living in Italy. Mark has to explain Judean customs to his audience. Mark gets the geography of Judea wrong. He explains Greek money by comparing it to Roman currency. From various comments that Mark drops, his audience is assailed. Quote, Mark 13:9, As for yourselves, beware, for they will hand you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings because of me, as a testimony to them. When they bring you to trial and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you at that time. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. And children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. End quote. Mark writes for hearers whose beliefs set themselves against the powers that be. Both the religious establishment of Judea, the civil establishment of Rome, and the demonic realm. Mark writes for a persecuted community. But which one? Scholars are agreed that Mark is the earliest of the Gospels. It was written sometime between Nero's persecution of the Christians after the Great Fire of Rome and the aftermath of the destruction of the temple under Nero's successor, the Emperor Vespasian. Matthew and Luke certainly know of the temple's fall. Whether Mark does is a moot point. Now, all this would place the Gospel's creation in the very narrow time range of the year 64 to the early 70s. Mark has an especial dislike of the Pharisees. He recounts many a story in which they oppose Jesus. In this quote from Mark, the Pharisees ask Jesus about a minor point of law. Jesus explodes with a full-throttle condemnation. And a side note. Listen to how Mark has to explain Jewish practices to his readers. That's an argument that Mark's audience was Gentile. Quote, Mark 7:1. Now when the Pharisees gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe. The washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? He said to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites. Then he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, honour your father and your mother. But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, whatever support you might have had from me is korban, that is, an offering to God, then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. And you do many things like this. End quote. Mark is notorious for his inelegant street language Greek, so unlike the more graceful language of his fellow evangelists. It may be that all the evangelists originally wrote that way, but Mark alone couldn't afford a good editor to polish his prose. Whatever the reason, Mark is raw and energetic. He is punchy. He often swaps tenses from the past to the present in the middle of a thought. That is common in spoken English and English fiction, but rarely seen otherwise in English prose. Mark often begins a clause with the word and. Mark is especially fond of the word immediately. Now, here's what I mean, and listen to how Mark mixes tenses in the final verse. Quote, Mark 1:16. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea. And Jesus said to them, follow me, and I will make you fish for people. And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them, and having left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired hands, they went away after them. And they go into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught. End quote. You won't find that exact wording in popular English translations. Modern English Bibles drop a lot of the immediatelys and ands. They correct Mark's tenses. They smooth out much of Mark's rough edges. In Mark, Jesus is not a pre-existent divine being. He is a human who was adopted by God at Jesus' baptism. Mark's favourite title for Jesus is Son of Man. As I babbled on in episode 2.13, grappling with the Greeks 4, Daniel and the Book of Parables. The title has a complex history. It is poetic Hebrew for human being. In the apocalyptic literature of the Second Temple period, the term was applied to the hero who would be God's judge at the end of times. Somewhere along the line, it became conflated with the title of Messiah. The Son of Man, spoken of in the book of 1st Enoch, would lead Israel against its enemies in conquest. Now, Jesus was meant to triumph, not die. The earliest Christians were dumbstruck. How could their hero die? Mark wrote his Gospel to explain to early Christians what on earth was going on. Mark reinterpreted the old Jewish concepts of Son of Man and the very vague idea of a Messiah. He created the idea that the Messiah was not a victorious general, but a suffering servant. Mark comforted his readers by explaining that Jesus' death was not an accident, not a calamity. God mandated his adopted son's suffering death. Jesus died as a ransom to save earthly sinners. Very soon now, God would reward us by bringing about the end of times, and Jesus would return in triumph. Mark is the most apocalyptic of the evangelists. If Mark had a theme song, it might be this.
Last night I lay sleeping, there came a dream so fair. I stood in old Jerusalem beside the temple there. I heard the children singing, and ever as they sang, methought the voice of angels from heaven in answer rang. Methought the voice of angels from heaven in answer rang. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, lift up your gates and sing. Hosanna in the highest, Hosanna to your King. And then methought my dream was changed, the streets no longer rang. Hushed were the glad hosannas, the little children sang. The sun grew dark with mystery, the morn was cold and chill, as the shadow of a cross arose upon a lonely hill. As the shadow of a cross arose upon a lonely hill. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, hark how the angels sing. Hosanna in the highest, Hosanna to your King. And once again the scene was changed, new earth there seemed to be. I saw the holy city beside the tideless sea. The light of God was on its streets, the gates were open wide, and all who would might enter, and no one was denied. No need of moon or star
He's convinced that God's kingly rule will soon be upon us. Jesus is God's instrument, unleashed on earth. Jesus says we must have prepared action plans. Quote, Mark 13:14. But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop must not go down or enter the house or take anything away. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not be in winter. End quote. Mark's use of the present tense suits his urgency. Mark wrote when Christians expected Jesus' imminent return. The other evangelists wrote a generation or two later. By then, no one thought that Jesus was coming back next Tuesday. The later Gospel writers depict the life of Jesus as a pivotal moment in human history, but they do not expect his imminent return. Mark does. In the Gospel of John, Jesus spends his life declaring he's the man, and don't you forget it. That's the impression that most people have about Jesus. He travelled throughout Palestine, proclaiming God's imminent kingly rule and his own part in that coming glory. Now, that is not how the Synoptic Gospels depict Jesus. In the Synoptics, Jesus is Clark Kent, not Superman. Jesus wants everyone to shut up about his real identity. The Gospel of Mark is the greatest keeper of the secret. Quote, Mark 1:40. A leper came to Jesus, begging him, and kneeling he said to him, If you choose, you can make me clean. Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, I do choose. Be made clean. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. After sternly warning him, Jesus sent him away at once, saying to him, See that you say nothing to anyone. And here is Mark 8:27. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, Who do people say that I am? And they answered him, John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets. He asked them, But who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, You are the Messiah. And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. End quote. Mark's narrative is riddled with dramatic irony. The reader always knows more than the characters in the story. At Jesus' crucifixion, the Romans and Jews mock Jesus as King of the Jews. But the reader knows that Jesus really is the King of the Jews. Mark thinks that the disciples are nitwits. They just don't get it. Time and time again, the disciples misunderstand Jesus. They cower in fear. Here is the famous walking on the water miracle, just after the feeding of the 5,000, with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Quote, Mark 6:45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened." End quote. After their call, the disciples are constant disappointments. They seek greatness for themselves rather than service. In the Passion narrative, they sleep when they should be watching, and then they flee. When Jesus is arrested, they are confused and perplexed. The disciple Peter is singled out for his 3 denials. In Mark, the disciples have little idea about Jesus' mission and purpose, and they have no idea about their own role in the unfolding of God's kingly rule. Mark spends a lot of time saying Jesus is a great teacher, without actually telling us what Jesus taught. When Mark does oblige us by throwing in a parable, he makes a point of saying that Jesus' teaching is only for the elect. No one else is meant to get it. Quote, Mark 4:10, "When he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, 'To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look but not perceive, and may indeed listen but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven.'" End quote. On to the evangelist and the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew's traditional symbol is an angel or winged man. Who knows? Matthew is the lengthiest of the Gospels. Matthew has long been regarded as the premier Gospel and has long been the most popular. It has everything you could ask for in a Gospel. Lots of stories, lots of parables. I mentioned that around the year 100, our old friend Papias cited Mark. He also mentions that someone called Matthew collected the sayings of Jesus. Is this our evangelist Matthew? We aren't sure. Another of our old friends who lived around the same time, Bishop Ignatius of Antioch, might also mention Matthew, but we can't quite be sure. The earliest references to Matthew that we can really trust only date from the late 2nd century, around the year 180. The fathers attributed the gospel to one Matthew, the disciple and tax collector from Capernaum, mentioned in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. Tradition held that he wrote in Hebrew, while Peter and Paul were in Rome. Matthew's status as a disciple propelled him to the top of the gospel charts. Neither Mark nor Luke were disciples. This tradition is almost certainly wrong. If Matthew was a disciple and eyewitness, why does he use so much of Mark, who was neither? If Matthew was a disciple, why is his book riddled with anachronisms? Matthew often has characters use the word rabbi, a title which only became popular after the fall of the temple. If Matthew wrote in Hebrew, why does his Greek match so often the Greek text of Mark? Few today believe that Matthew was a disciple. The consensus is that the Gospel was written after the fall of the temple, somewhere between the years 80 to 100. Many scholars believe that the Gospel was written in the great city of Antioch in Syria. Matthew is surely an urbanite. Where the other Gospels use the term village, Matthew always substitutes the word city. Matthew doesn't do villages. The Gospel of Matthew might be related to something called the Gospel of the Hebrews. That Gospel is only preserved in quotations and references by the Church Fathers. The compiler of the Latin Vulgate, St. Jerome, thought it was the Hebrew or Aramaic original of Matthew. Modern scholars think that very unlikely, but otherwise do not know what to make of the Gospel of Hebrews. If the historical dice had rolled another way, perhaps we would be reading the Gospel of the Hebrews, not the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew might also be what little we can tell. The Gospel of the Nazarenes was an Aramaic translation of Matthew, stripped of its opening chapters about the divine birth of Jesus. We know nothing about the Nazarenes. The early church fathers left us better informed about the Ebionites. They were a Jewish Christian group that followed the Apostle Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. As I will discuss in episode after episode to come, the early Jesus clubs were split. Some believed that Jesus had shown Jews how to follow true Judaism, as Peter and James had said. Other Jesus clubs followed Paul, who insisted that Jesus showed all the nations how to follow a universal God. The Ebionites believed that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, sent from the Jewish God to the Jewish people in fulfillment of Jewish scriptures. Jesus had been adopted by God because he kept the law perfectly. Jesus was the most righteous man on earth. God gave Jesus a special mission, to sacrifice himself for the sake of others. Jesus went to the cross as a punishment for the sins of the world, a perfect sacrifice in fulfillment of God's promise to his people. Jews would no longer have to offer their own meagre sacrifices at the temple. Accepting Jesus' sacrifice, God raised him from the dead and exalted him to heaven. A generation after the Gospel of Matthew was written, the Ebionites were drowned by the tide of history, after the Roman war against the Judeans in 135. Matthew includes almost all of the Gospel of Mark, more than Luke does. Matthew also shares a large amount of material with the Gospel of Luke, the mysterious Q source. Matthew treats his Markan source critically. Matthew improves Mark's poor Greek and remedies what he sees as Mark's coyness about Jesus' messianic identity. He is much kinder to the disciples than Mark. Only Matthew confirms Peter as the rock of the church and records Peter's exclamation that Jesus is the Messiah. Like Mark, Matthew also believes that Jesus died as a ransom, that he was the Messiah and Son of God. Was Jesus a human whom God adopted, or was he a divine being who existed from the beginning of time? Matthew isn't interested. Matthew is much more keen to show us Jesus as a Jew. In his first chapter, Matthew's detailed genealogy shows that Jesus is an anointed one of the line of David. Matthew also presents Jesus as a new lawgiver, one who can interpret the laws of Moses as they should be interpreted. Where Mark says that the parables are meant to hide Jesus' message from the crowd, Matthew says the parables reveal Jesus' message. Now, in this passage, Jesus quotes Psalm 78. Quote, Mark 13:34. Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables. Without a parable he told them nothing. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth to speak in parables. I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world. End quote. Where Matthew really differs from Mark is by adding 5 long speeches by Jesus, the famous Sermon on the Mount amongst them. These 5 speeches of Jesus may be Matthew's way of paralleling the 5 books of the Torah. Matthew does some odd things with Mark. He often takes a story from Mark and tells it twice. Not only does Matthew double the story, Matthew also doubles the number of characters in the story. Here is the story of the blind beggar from the Gospel of Mark. In Mark, the encounter occurs during Jesus' final weeks. Quote, Mark 10:46. As Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a blind beggar was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man. So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. End quote. Matthew's first version of the story is set in Jesus' early career, just after Jesus has called the disciples. Quote, Matthew 9:27. As Jesus went on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying loudly, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." When he entered the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" They said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." And their eyes were opened. End quote. Matthew's second version of the story is in chapter 20. The second retelling accords with Mark's timeline. Jesus is about to meet his fate in Jerusalem. Quote, Matthew 20:29. As they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. There were 2 blind men sitting by the roadside. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they shouted, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." The crowd sternly ordered them to be quiet, but they shouted even more loudly, "Have mercy on us, Lord, Son of David." Jesus stood still and called them, saying, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Lord, let our eyes be opened." Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes. Immediately they regained their sight and followed him. End quote. I'll continue my dissection of the Gospel of Matthew in the next episode of the History in the Bible. Thanks for listening. For maps, charts, and diagrams, check out my website, www.historyinthebible.com.